Is this monitor the holy grail for hardcore competitive gamers? This is the AOC Agon AG274QS, not to be confused with the QG. That is a 27-inch IPS panel that runs 1440p at 300Hz. Yes, you heard that right. Now in this review, you're going to see if it's actually worth its price tag, because in the UK it can be found for a whopping £930. Now before jumping into my review, I do want to point out something quite important, and here it's because AOC have included two DisplayPort 1.4 inputs, which will definitely be good for you outputting 1440p at 300Hz with DSC support. However, if you are running an HDMI setup, for example with a laptop, you'll be disappointed to hear that AOC have only included two HDMI 2.0 ports, and as such means you'll be limited to 1440p at 144Hz. As a result, means that if you do not have access to a DisplayPort input/output, then you'll probably just want to look elsewhere and completely put this monitor aside. I feel here AOC really should have included two HDMI 2.1 ports in order to further the bandwidth and all the capabilities of this monitor with a variety of different setups. So with that out of the way, let's talk about its gaming performance. And first off, objectively, its input lag is quite interesting. Here you'll be able to see two separate results, 2.3 milliseconds and a 5.3 milliseconds, one of the lowest and indeed the highest figures that I've tested to date. Now why is this? Well, here it's because AOC provide a low input lag mode which you can enable or disable. Frankly, I'm not really sure why they do this, because there's no inherent disadvantages of having low input lag mode permanently enabled, and of course given the results that I've just shared, you'll probably want to enable this at all times. Now here in this respect, subjectively with low input lag mode enabled, my mouse clicks were being registered extremely well in Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I had no problems when it came to registering my input, but of course me finding people's heads or indeed finding people's bodies if I was using an op was very much a different case. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that when it comes to esports, input lag is extremely important, and suffice to say this AOC monitor definitely ticks that box. Now of course input lag is only one side of the puzzle, so what about when it comes to its response time? Well, through the monitor's OSD you've got a few different levels that you can select, in other words the overdrive modes. You've got off, weak, medium, strong and boost. We'll talk about the latter very shortly. Now in terms of its off mode, I had it tested via the OSRTT tool, and here you can see that it has a tested initial time, which is the average D2G time, of 5.32 milliseconds with overdrive completely disabled, which is very impressive. Move down to weak, you get 4.37 milliseconds, which is even better. Move down to medium, we're getting to 3.54 milliseconds. And if we move down to strong, here it's seriously impressive at a 2.84 milliseconds, which is one of the lowest figures that I've noted to date, making it one of the fastest gaming monitors that I have actually tested. Now, what does this also mean when it comes to the overall visual experience? Well, here you can see a screenshot of the different UFO tests. This is all tested at 300Hz. You can see the differences between off, weak, medium and strong, whereby in the strongest setting there is a little bit of overshoot ghosting that occurs, specifically in the darker and also a little bit of the much lighter scenes. Now what I will say in terms of a real world experience is that when playing a game such as Destiny 2, which is quite graphically intense, I ended up using the medium overdrive mode. However, when I was playing a game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive or even Valorant, I actually ended up siding towards the strongest overdrive mode, because I felt that the inverse ghosting wasn't too much for me to throw off my shots. Now the same comments couldn't be said about the AOC AG274QG, its near identical sibling, which does actually have quite a bit of inverse ghosting in terms of the strongest overdrive mode. Ultimately here, this monitor, the QS, seems to be better tuned, and as a result, running in terms of its strongest overdrive mode actually results in the fastest and indeed the best sort of experience that one can attain, at least if you're playing a hardcore competitive game that looks a little bit like a potato, and that is of course CSGO. Now don't worry, I haven't forgotten about the boost mode overdrive, which as you'll be able to see actually makes the UFO a lot more clearer, and this is because it's the same as running MBR, motion blur reduction, in terms of its maximum level 20. Now there's 20 level increments if you do not want to use the boost mode overdrive shortcut, and therefore means that you can play around with the MBR level. This will be of importance if you want to adjust the brightness here, because of course in its maximum overdrive mode, in other words boost or indeed MBR 20, the brightness of the monitor is actually quite dim, and we'll touch upon how dim further down into review, so definitely do stay tuned for that. Now the only thing to be mindful about in this section is the fact that if you do enable MBR and or the boost mode overdrive, you can't run it simultaneously with AMD FreeSync and or of course NVIDIA G-Sync. This is somewhat of a shame in comparison to some of its competitors out there, at least in the 240 or 144 Hz space. Now if you're liking what you're seeing so far, let me know in the comments below what you make of the monitor. And also if you haven't already, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribe or even hitting that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering independent, honest reviews like this one. So speaking about the adaptive sync technologies, let's talk about NVIDIA G-Sync, because if you remember rightly, I am running an RTX 3080, and indeed when connected over DisplayPort, I had no problems running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. I had no sort of artifacts or black screen issues. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on your own setup. Now it's worth bearing in mind here that the FreeSync range, or indeed the NVIDIA G-Sync range, is actually 48 all the way up to 300 Hz. By comparison, however, the AOC AG274QG, it's somewhat of a near identical sibling, actually runs from 1 all the way up to 240 Hz, which is far more impressive, and that's because that monitor has a native G-Sync module, and of course the QS doesn't. Now in my case, I don't actually really care all that much about AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, at least when it comes to a game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And the reason behind that is because I don't want my frames to be actually capped, and I want to completely mitigate any sort of input lag that might be occurring, even though it'll be pretty minimal in this respect. Nonetheless, it's just something I thought to share and of course give my own experiences when it comes to playing hardcore competitive games. Now aside from your hardcore esports titles, what about when it comes to other games? Well, this monitor has got 1440p at 300 Hz, but I was able to run it simultaneously with NVIDIA G-Sync and HDR, all of which were working in tandem when I was playing Destiny 2. This meant I had a tear-free gaming experience which extended all the way up to 300 Hz, and indeed that extra bit of headroom meant that the monitor was able to keep up with all those extra frames. Now suffice to say, if you do want to run 300 Hz consistently at 1440p, you're going to want to look at a beefier GPU setup. Here the RTX 3080 struggled to keep up in certain departments, and as a result I'll have to look for a more expensive GPU or indeed a multi-GPU setup. Now while the added headroom of the AG274QS is certainly appreciated over other 1440p 240 Hz monitors, what isn't as impressive however is the overall HDR experience. Here I felt it was quite lackluster, and let alone that, objectively the monitor actually has only 8 local dimming zones, and this meant that it was no competition to its sibling, the AG274QG, that has 32 local dimming zones, or similarly the likes of the Samsung Odyssey G9 or the Alienware AW2721D. Frankly, all these monitors completely trump this monitor when it comes to its HDR experience. And of course, there's some other monitors out there on the market that of course I haven't tested, from mini LED or full array local dimming monitors. Frankly, here the HDR experience is quite poor, and given the price of the monitor, I think AOC should have really included more local dimming zones, at the very least actually matching the 274QG's 32 local dimming zones. Now to round off the gaming section, I do want to have a quick mention for the console gamers out there. Now of course, if you're a console gamer, you should not be looking solely at this monitor. In other words, anything over 144 Hz makes absolutely no sense. If, however, you're someone who is going to be using this as a primary PC monitor, and you're also a console gamer and therefore going to be connecting over the HDMI ports, this section will be of interest to you. Now if you're on Xbox or on PlayStation, you'll be able to run Full HD at 120 Hz. If you move over to 1440p, it'll only be the Xbox that supports 1440p at 120 Hz over its HDMI 2.0 ports. Now thankfully the monitor does have a 4K signal input and therefore can emulate a 4K signal. As such, if you're on PlayStation or on Xbox, you'll be able to run 4K at 60 Hz. As such, this is what I had tested when I was running my 4K Blu-ray player. This means that PlayStation gamers don't have to worry about running Full HD, but rather can benefit from a higher resolution, which is more than Full HD. Now with the gaming section out of the way, how does this monitor actually look like? Well, here it's got a flat 27-inch IPS panel that runs 1440p at 300 Hz. Now it does also have a dedicated sRGB emulation mode which can be selected through the OSD. In said mode, I had it tested at 96.9% sRGB gamut coverage and 105.5% gamut volume. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard. Here the average delta-E was tested at 1.14 and a maximum of 3.18. Lower is better, and indeed over here the results are actually pretty impressive. As for the tested contrast ratio, it is 1101 to 1, which is certainly good for an IPS panel, and as for the measured white point, it was 6050 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it was quite near to 2.2 standard, which is certainly impressive. Now, if you're not going to be doing any sort of serious image editing work or indeed photo grading, you might want to have the colors pop a little bit more and therefore run it in one of the other modes, such as the warm preset. Here you'll be able to see that it was tested at 97.7% sRGB, but it extended over at 131.9%. Indeed, it has a wide color gamut. You can see here the Adobe and DCI-P3 standards have been affected. Below, you can see how the monitor compares to the DCI-P3 standards. Now, as for the average delta-E in comparison to the sRGB standard, it's 2.98 with a maximum of 8.61, which of course has therefore raised and therefore makes it less color accurate if you're working in the sRGB space. As for the measured white point, it does change at 5974 Kelvin at 100%, but yet here the gamma curve at 2.2 is quite near to what it was before in the sRGB mode, and therefore is certainly acceptable. Now, aside from its color accuracy, what about when it comes to its brightness? Well, here in terms of HDR, I had it tested at 581 nits, which is a little bit below the HDR 600 certification. Nonetheless, the maximum SDR brightness was tested at 354 nits, which is pretty much on point with what the manufacturer claims. It is worth bearing in mind that the sRGB mode does lock the brightness at 237 nits, which is quite a shame. Nonetheless, the brightness level will be good for most individuals, but it's still a shame that it is actually locked and you don't have the ability to adjust it. As for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 47 nits, and as for the boost mode overdrive or MBR20, it gets all the way down to 38 nits, which is actually very dim and therefore can only be used in a very dark lit room. Moving swiftly on, in terms of its brightness uniformity, it's okay across the board, but for a monitor of its price, I was actually expecting a little bit better. Of course, this is somewhat panel lottery. As for the backlight bleed, given all IPS panels do suffer from a little bit of bleed, here the monitor does suffer from it in terms of the corners. It is acceptable in my opinion, however, it is still disappointing that this monitor does not have any variable backlight control and as such couldn't reduce the backlight bleed as a result of it. This means that if you are going to be sensitive to backlight bleed, you might want to look at a VA panel or, for example, a TN panel altogether. Now, moving on to the monitor's OSD that can be accessed through a physical joystick button found behind the monitor or via a wired puck, you'll be able to see a plethora of options. First off, in terms of game settings, I'll leave game mode disabled. And as for MBR, as I did mention before, it can't be used simultaneously with AMD FreeSync and or NVIDIA G-Sync. The overdrive modes, when said modes are disabled, you'll be able to see the boost mode available over here. As for low input lag mode, I'd always leave that enabled, as I did mention before. And as for the quick switch LED, that's the LED indicator light that is found next to the puck. Now, as for the luminance, you've got brightness and contrast modes, eco mode, and gamma and DCR. I'd leave the gamma at level 1 and leave DCR disabled. As for the image setup, you do have HDR emulation modes, which are pretty pointless and skew with the color accuracy, but in HDR you do also have display HDR, which pops up in this menu, which is the mode that I would definitely select if you're running an HDR signal. As for color setup, you do have a variety of different modes to choose from, such as warm, normal, cool, or for example sRGB, which is quite accurate. As for the DCB modes, I would leave these disabled, or the DCB demo. You do also have low blue modes, which you can select, and therefore reducing the blue light that's emitted. As for audio, you do have two 5-watt speakers built in, which will certainly suffice for basic music listening, and if you're using the built-in monitor speakers, I would suggest running on the game DTS sound preset, which will disable the EQ controls. But of course, if you are like myself, you'll have a set of bookshelf speakers, a DAC, and or a set of headphones. Now, as for the light effects, you can enable this if you want, and you've got low, medium, and strong. And here it's the RGB lights, which are positioned underneath the monitor and towards the back. Now, personally, I don't quite see the point of having any RGB lights, so I completely disable this, but nonetheless, if you were to wanting to adjust these settings, you can do so for yourself via the OSD, and therefore makes it quite convenient. Now, another inclusion which I don't quite understand is the logo projection. This is a logo projection of the AOC or Agon logo, which is projected towards the bottom of the monitor. If you want to use this for some given reason, then you can adjust the intensity, the RGB gains as well, so therefore customizing the color. Through these menus as well, you'll be able to reset the monitor and also set an off timer. Now, as for the logo projection, is yet another feature which I completely disabled. Now, as for the OSD setup, it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's useful to make sure the DP capability is at maximum in order for you to benefit from the maximum refresh rate and resolution. Now, moving past the monitor's OSD, I would also like to point out the overall design aesthetics, and from the front it's actually not too bad, whereas it's got a three-side borderless design. This means the 27-inch form factor doesn't take up too much space, at least not in my opinion. The bottom bezel could have been a little bit thinner, and as for the AOC Agon logo, it also could have been a little bit less obstructive. Now, as for the stand, it does provide a height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment. However, the overall tilt adjustment does seem a little bit limited. In my case, it's because the stand doesn't actually properly fit on my IKEA Freddy desk, and as a result, in terms of the top shelf, it means that it has to be slid a little bit forwards. This makes it a little bit disconcerting when it comes to be using the monitor on a day-to-day basis, because I would be afraid of it actually sliding downwards. This means that it meant that the monitor's stand would be actually replaced if I were to own the monitor, and therefore I'd be looking at a monitor arm instead. Of course, here the monitor does support VESA 100x100, and as a result means that you can completely ditch the monitor stand that comes included, or you can fit it in a multi-monitor setup. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and quite frankly, the AOC Agon AG274QS is a fantastic performer. In other words, when it comes to hardcore esports gamers, the extra 60Hz will be appreciated at 1440p, and furthermore its input lag and response time are absolutely class leading and one of the fastest that I've tested to date. As such, it gets my performance award. However, I can't outright recommend it because it actually has somewhat of a lackluster performance elsewhere. The lack of extra local dimming zones when it comes to its HDR experience, the fact it doesn't have a native G-Sync module, therefore limiting its VRR range, and also from the fact that it has a locked sRGB mode for those people who are actually going to be using it for photo or video editing work. There are some other monitors out there on the market, including the sibling, the AG274QG, the Samsung Odyssey G7, or the Alienware AW2721D, all of which that I've tested, and the reviews will be down in the description below for your consideration. Now, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts of the monitor in the comments section below, and if it's a monitor that you'd actually splash out £930 on. Now, if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hit that bell notification, as all of which will be definitely greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.